and understands history and scholarship and politics and theology and philosophy.
My guest this week is an author, a filmmaker, a former policy advisor to Ronald Reagan,
Mr. Dinesh D'Souza.
This American dream is a dream not just of economic opportunity or success, but it's ultimately a dream where you can be the architect of your own destiny.
I grew up in a different world, actually a world without America. And although I grew up without a phone, without television, without hot water, we had a car, but if you looked down the floor of our car, you could see the ground.
He's been described as an influential conservative thinker. He's a best-selling author, political commentator, and filmmaker.
The great man, Dinesh D'Souza, a patriotic man.
No longer would I say that I live in a rarefied world of intellectual debate. I've seen the upside of America, and I've seen the downside of America. But at the end of the day, I wouldn't trade the United States for any other country. At the end of the day, my enthusiasm for American government may have dimmed, but my enthusiasm for this country burns brighter than ever. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dinesh D'Souza.
Wow, this is fantastic. I must say this is a little bit of a narrow podium, and I'm really relieved I remembered to wear pants. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm joined by my wife Debbie, and we're both immigrants. She from Venezuela, me from India. And in thinking about this topic, what's great about America, what's unique about America, my mind flashes back to when I was 17 years old and first saw America. It was actually out of the airplane as it descended on New York City, and I could see the skyline of New York, and I saw the Statue of Liberty. And I remember a kind of a strange feeling came over me because I realized, even at 17, that my life was going to be completely different from that moment on. I felt intuitively that I was moving from the margin of the world to the center. And I recognized, however indistinctly, that I would be able to, in this country, do things with my life that would never be possible if I stayed back in India or lived anyplace else. In other words, America is a country in which we can be, to a degree other people would find almost unthinkable, we can be the architect of our own destiny. We can be in the driver's seat of our own future. This is a country in which your destiny is not given to you so much as constructed by you. And yet, even though immigrants experience this about America, when we come to America, we are actually told a different story, or stories. And these are, you may say, the progressive narratives that we typically encounter when we set foot on a college campus. I mean, I noticed it myself. The moment I got to Dartmouth, almost clinically 1 year after I arrived in America, I set foot in the college classroom, and I would hear mantras. To me, the most memorable one, which I think is sort of still with us, is the multicultural mantra that all cultures are basically equal. No culture is better or worse, superior or inferior to any other. And I thought to myself, what an odd thing to say. I mean, first of all, as an immigrant, I knew that immigration itself is a walking refutation of cultural relativism. And what I mean by that is that the immigrant who is naturally attached to his or her own culture, we're born into a world and it's our family, our friends, our school, our neighbors. It's the only world we know and it's the only world we can love. And why would we leave it? And why would we take the incredibly risky, dangerous, vertiginous, confusing step of going to another unknown culture? Why would we do that? Why would we vote with our feet in that way if we weren't completely convinced that this other culture is better and offers a better life, at least for us, and that's why we do it? And so the immigrant, I'm not talking now about the refugee who is flung, but the immigrant who chooses is actually casting a ballot, you might say, in favor of America. And so, based on that alone, regardless of what immigrants say, what they do suggests that they think America is the best country in the world. Now, as we get to America, we confront, and we see this now not just going back to my college days, but today, we're enmeshed in a massive political debate in which the issues that were once confined to the college campus, is America a good country? Is America a country stained by the original sins of slavery and white supremacy and racism? Is there a fascist streak in American culture? These campus issues have, in a sense, blown up on the national stage. And I think you know that pretty much as we speak, you have marauding mobs who are pulling down Confederate monuments and athletes who are taking a knee. And all of this is a way of sort of signaling a protest against not just America, but a certain view of America. And it's that view of America that I want to calmly analyze and dissect today. So, this is the progressive narrative. One may call it it's not a media story, it's a meta story, a story behind the story, because it's ultimately the story about America that a lot of journalists, a lot of Hollywood figures, this is the background of how they think about America. And so the argument goes that America basically is a country that was ill-founded. The founders basically made a mess of it. Why? Because they created a country that was supposedly dedicated to equality, all men are created equal, but permitted, if not encouraged, the original sin of slavery. Slavery contaminated even further with white supremacy. This was the American founding itself. And so the founding obviously becomes a problem, something that America has to get away from, something we have to progress beyond. And this is the mission of American progressivism. Progressivism identifies itself with progress, identifies itself with a democratic party that basically says that we are the ones who are devoted to expanding the franchise. We are the ones, the progressives, the Democrats, devoted to fighting against oppression, ending white supremacy, giving equal rights to everybody, the black, the Latino, the outsider, the immigrant, and to women, to gays. We are the party of liberation. And we have to fight against, the progressives say, the continual efforts to protect white supremacy. Not just the effort to elevate the founders, but also this reactionary modern conservatism, which is trying to conserve, if anything else, it's conserving oppression. It's conserving what is essentially bad about America. And then there is, to make things worse, one Donald J. Trump, who is not only, in the progressive view, kind of a racist, but he's also a fascist. A fascist. And the conservatives who support him are sort of the modern version of the neo-Nazis. And this narrative, again, was very much supported by what we saw in Charlottesville. You see neo-Nazis and KKK guys, and they're wearing Make America Great Again hats. And so this, right then, is the progressive storyline in a nutshell. I think I've done it justice by representing it fairly. In an argument, always remember, try to present the other side as it understands itself. And that's what I'm trying to do here this evening. Now, this is the narrative I want to take on, and I want to take it on by offering you a rival narrative. And the rival narrative is that the American founders were not the bad guys. That the so-called sins of the American founding were, I'm going to call them sins of necessity. By sins of necessity, what I mean is that they are lesser evils. They are evils that are tolerated to prevent greater evils. And so the founders, on the balance, are not bad guys, and in fact created a great country on a great principle. I'm going to show that the progressive Democrats, the very people who claim to be the forces of liberation, are actually responsible for the vilest, most hideous, most racist, most destructive, and most fascist acts, not only of American history, but have also contributed to the worst atrocities of European history, including the Holocaust. I'm going to show that this is the actual history of modern progressivism and of the Democratic Party. And the point of showing you this is the following. It is a way of exposing that a lot of what we see in American politics today is a kind of a camouflage. Let's start with the business about the Confederate monuments. So they want to pull down a statue of Robert E. Lee. Now that's a very odd choice for a guy to want to revile. Robert E. Lee was the most distinguished soldier in the U.S. military. Abraham Lincoln offered him the command of the Union Army. The only reason he didn't join the Union is he didn't want to do battle with his own relatives in Virginia. Robert E. Lee did inherit some slaves on his wife's side, but he never managed any of them. He never ran a plantation. He was over in West Point as a military man, and he opposed slavery and prayed for the end of it to come soon. This is the actual Robert E. Lee. And then they want to pull down statues of Confederate soldiers. But the ordinary Confederate soldier was not a slave owner. The ordinary Confederate soldier was a farmer or a worker. This was a guy who was dirt poor. Interviewed at the time during the war, one Confederate soldier was asked, "Why are you fighting? You don't own any slaves. Why are you fighting on the Confederate side?" And he goes, "I'm fighting because the Yankees are down here." End of story. Now this becomes the poster boy for the evils of American history. Give me a break. Something fishy is going on. Notice that the Confederate statues are statues of Democrats being pulled down by other Democrats. Very interesting. Very interesting. Now, one might think that the Democratic Party is sort of taking responsibility. The Democratic Party is saying, yes, we actually were the party of slavery. But that's not what's going on here. What's going on here is kind of a big lie. And the big lie is, let's take the sins of the Democratic Party and put them on the South. Let's blame the South for what we did. Now, here's why I say that. Because, of course, I have to anticipate the obvious objection. Well, wait a minute, Dinesh, wasn't the slavery debate between the North and the South? No. No. The secession debate was, in fact, between the North and the South. But the slavery debate was between a pro-slavery Democratic Party, North and South, and an anti-slavery Republican Party. This was a straight-out partisan debate. When Abraham Lincoln identified the three bad guys of American slavery, two of them were Northerners. One was Roger Taney, who wrote the Dred Scott decision, and he was a Southerner. But Buchanan, the president, was from Pennsylvania. He was a Northerner. And Stephen Douglas, who ran against Lincoln in 1860, was the senator from Illinois, also a Northerner. By the way, Stephen Douglas's statue is standing right there in Chicago. There's no Antifa attempt to pull it down. I want to point out that the American founders here are not the bad guys. Why? Because the choice that they faced was not a choice of let's have slavery in the Union or let's have a union that excludes slavery. If the founders had that choice and they checked the box for slavery, we would be right to blame them. But the actual choice facing the founders was a different one. And that is, should we have a union based on anti-slavery principles that tolerate slavery for a time, or should we have no union at all? That was the actual practical choice facing the founders. Why? Because slavery was legal in each one of the states that got together in Philadelphia. The founders, if they decided to have a union that excluded slavery at the outset, most of those states, and certainly the southern states, would not have joined at all. So remember that in the world we have to choose between the options that were given. We can't choose options that are not even on the table. Now, were the founders racist? The answer is most of them were not. Probably the most racist of them all was Jefferson. And Jefferson, although he said that he had in his mind a suspicion that blacks were intellectually inferior to whites, he said at the same time, I don't know this to be true. I pray it is not true, and I'm hoping to be shown evidence that it is not true. And even if it is true, and I now quote Jefferson, whatever be their talents, it is no measure of their rights. In other words, whether people are superior or inferior, smarter or less smart, doesn't have any bearing on whether or not they are given equal rights. Some whites are smarter than other whites. That doesn't mean that some whites enjoy First Amendment rights and others don't. They all do. We all do. So Jefferson acknowledged from the beginning that rights apply to everybody. And he fulminated. Think of how odd this is for a Virginia planter who owns 200 slaves. Fulminated against slavery and basically said that slavery has no attribute that God, the Almighty, could side with. He predicted terrible convulsions if this problem was not dealt with and eradicated. So this is Jefferson. Now this Jeffersonian position, you might say, cannot even be compared to the extreme racism of the Democratic Party after it was founded in 1828. The Democrats were racist in a completely different degree and dimension than anything you can hear from the founders. And this is actually very interesting because in our textbooks and in our public rhetoric, you never see anyone attack the Democratic Party. It never happens. People are always picking out Washington, Jefferson. But in fact, the Democratic Party is the first party in the world. Slavery is a universal institution. And no one had the chutzpah to say that slavery is good for the slave until the Democrats came along. The Democrats invented the positive good school in which they argued slavery is not just good for the master, which everybody knows. It's kind of fun to get some other guy to work for you for free. But slavery is good for the slave. Even the Nazis didn't have the chutzpah to claim that what they were doing to the Jews was good for the Jews. But the Democrats, led at that time by Senator John C. Calhoun, articulated and advanced, in all seriousness, this pro-slavery argument. Now, a lot of times when I say these things, people will say to me, well, Dinesh, you're being a little too simplistic because when you're dealing with the parties, there's a lot of blame to go around. Certainly the Republicans, the Democrats, they shared this national responsibility for slavery. This is actually a complete lie. And I can demonstrate the lie very simply by pointing out the following single fact. And that is that in 1860, the year before the Civil War, no Republican owned a slave. I'm not saying no Republican leader owned a slave. I'm saying no Republican in the United States owned a slave. All the slaves in the country, think about it, there were 4 million of them, were owned by Democrats. Now, when I said this in the movie Hillary's America 1 year ago, there was a big convulsion and leftists and progressives were thrashing around for months to find counterexamples. And the beauty of my statement is it's kind of a scientific statement, which is to say it is refutable. All you have to do is give me the names of 5 Republicans who own slaves, and I would have to take it back. But to this moment, no one has been able to do that. A few months ago, one assiduous researcher on a left-wing campus said, I gotcha, Dinesh, I gotcha. Ulysses S. Grant inherited a slave, a solitary slave, on his wife's side. And I said, you almost got me, because at the time that this happened to Ulysses S. Grant, he was a Democrat. So, a nice try, but even that fell a little bit short. Now, here's where I'm going with all this. After the Civil War, because remember, this is not just a debate about slavery, this is also a debate about what came after slavery. And what came after slavery was the institutionalization of this terrible notion of white supremacy, but white supremacy and accompanied by racial terrorism, the Ku Klux Klan. If you think of the first domestic terrorists were groups like the Ku Klux Klan, and there were other groups like that as well. Now, it's very important to realize that these institutions of white supremacy, of white nationalism, are the actual invention of the official Democratic Party. They're not random groups that just started. They're not right-wingers. They're actually creations of an actual political party that use these groups as a paramilitary force to essentially promote white supremacy throughout the South. And not just throughout the South. The later, when Woodrow Wilson showed the movie Birth of a Nation in the White House, Ku Klux Klan chapters opened up in Maine, in Indiana, in California. They spread nationwide. So once again, this is not simply a Southern phenomenon, and it's a big lie to pin it all on the South. Now think of it. All these guys who are taking a knee and blaming America. America did this, America did that. No, America didn't do it. Some Americans did it, and other Americans stopped them. The important question is, which ones? Who did it? And this is again the big lie in action. Because, remember, we had a civil war. 600,000 people died in that war. 300,000 on the southern side, 300,000 on the northern side. This actually means that from the Union armies, driven really by the Republican Party, 300,000 white guys died to end slavery. You want them to pay reparations? You're taking a knee about them? Are they the bad guys? So it's very important here not to become a sucker. I mean, I forgive guys like Colin Kaepernick. This is a guy basically who runs with the ball. So I don't expect him to know a whole lot about American history. He's repeating what he's been told. At one point, Abraham Lincoln said, "Must I shoot the simple soldier boy who deserts and leave untouched the wily agitator who encourages him to desert?" In other words, I place the blame for the big lie on progressive academia. That's where the lie is hatched. And then dummies in the media, by which I mean people like Rachel Maddow, Van Jones, Chris Matthews, Bill Maher. By the way, all these guys, they'll bloviate about fascism from the time of the election. But when I put a book out on the subject and they can see, whoa, here's a guy who knows what he's talking about, they all run down rabbit holes. And it's not because they don't want to have me on their show. I've been on Bill Maher's show 10 times. I was on Politically Incorrect on ABC. I've been on Real Time with Bill Maher. It's just that the left is scared of confronting the real argument. They like to have real stupid guys on so they can take them on. But they'll never take on somebody who actually knows what they're talking about. Now, let me fast forward a little bit and say a word about what interested me when I thought about my most recent book, The Big Lie, was the deep parallels between the Ku Klux Klan in the United States and the brown shirts in Nazi Germany. What struck me thinking about it was in the 1920s, by the way, in Charlottesville, we'll see, I saw an amazing picture on social media a couple of days ago. It's literally in Charlottesville, one white supremacist surrounded by like 15 reporters. 15 reporters are interviewing one white supremacist. And think about it, why would they do that? Why would they inflate the reputation of this one guy, a complete loser? So what if he calls himself a neo-Nazi? He's a complete imbecile. Most likely Hitler would have gassed him. And yet this poor guy You know, this poor guy, well, Hitler actually had a whole category for imbeciles. So what I'm getting at here is that this poor guy has now become a totem of the sins of America. Why? Because actually he's not the real target. The real target is Trump. The real target is actually the Republicans. Now, back to the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan at one time had real power. In the 1920s, 50,000 hooded Klansmen marched on Fifth Avenue in New York City. Where were they going? Madison Square Garden. What was happening? The Democratic National Convention. Many of the Klansmen were delegates. I do want to tell you that virtually every head of the Ku Klux Klan, both national and regional, every Kleagle, every Grand Dragon, has been a Democrat with maybe 2 or 3 exceptions. That's why when people say, what about David Duke? They're literally talking about the one guy that they can point on the other side. And by the way, David Duke is like excommunicated in the Republican Party. By contrast, a guy like Robert Byrd remains a kind of revered figure in the Democratic Party. Bill Clinton was at his funeral, so was Obama. Now, in the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan had 3 to 4 million members. So did the Nazi brown shirts. By the way, both groups are totally into costumes. They love elaborate, crazy stuff. Both groups carry sticks, batons, weapons. Both groups are into hazing, racial terrorism. And both groups are the extension of an actual political party. Obviously, the brown shirts were an extension of the Nazi Party. And the Klan, I'm now quoting the progressive historian at Columbia University, Philip Foner, the Ku Klux Klan was for decades, quote, the domestic terrorist arm of the Democratic Party, end quote. So when the Klan had real power, when it was really stringing up people, when it was organizing what it called Negro barbecues, this was being done with the cooperation and indeed the encouragement of Democratic sheriffs, city officials, and so on. Every segregation law in the South was passed by a Democratic legislature and signed by a Democratic governor. There is no exception to that rule. So, here we have a Democratic Party that has been complicit, not only in slavery, segregation, Jim Crow, racial terrorism. And now we turn to the civil rights movement. Well, didn't the Democrats rescue themselves? Didn't they do the civil rights movement? Didn't the opposition to the civil rights movement come from the Republicans? No, no. More Republicans voted for the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I'm talking about proportionally. There were fewer Republicans in Congress than Democrats, so we're looking at proportions. More Republicans proportionally voted for the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, and the Fair Housing Bill of 1968. Don't take my word for it, you look it up. And so as a last-ditch effort, I'm now kind of skirmishing with a professor of history at Princeton, Kevin Cruz, and he's lining up a kind of mob of left-wing historians to denounce me, and all of them are hinging their argument, or many of them, on what's called the big switch. The big switch. The big switch is, of course, the idea that the two parties traded positions. They swapped platforms. Basically, the Republicans became Democrats, and the Democrats became Republicans. Now, really, if anyone knows about American history, on the face of it, a claim like this is a little suspect. It's kind of like if I came to you and said, you know, on a certain date in the 1960s, all the cops in America became robbers, and all the robbers became cops. You'd be like, really? Did that really happen? How would that even occur? Are you actually saying the parties just decided to trade platforms with each other? And so the whole idea here is that the racist Democrats, the infamous Dixiecrats, became Republicans. And the whole case hinges on that. And if that statement were true, if you saw these racist Dixiecrats trading in their Democratic cards and becoming Republicans, this would give this a lot of evidentiary support. But in reality, and again, don't take my word for it, there is only a single solitary Dixiecrat. One guy, Strom Thurmond, who was a racist Dixiecrat and did in fact become a Republican, and every other Dixiecrat remained in the Democratic Party and died a Democrat. And that is a fact. That's not my fact. That's not my controversial claim. That is the undisputed, unvarnished, unchallenged truth. So there was no big switch. Now, there were certain switches, but they have nothing to do with race. Blacks who used to be Republicans did become Democrats. When? in the 1930s. You look it up. In 1936, 71% of African Americans voted for FDR. Pretty amazing. The Democratic Party at that time was the party of the Klan and segregation. Blacks were leaving the party of Lincoln and the party that passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments against massive Democratic opposition and joining the party of the Klan. Why? Why would they do that? Well, it was the Great Depression. And well, the New Deal did offer meager, but nevertheless, they did offer some economic benefits. So the black switch was over New Deal benefits and had nothing to do with race. The Southern switch, there was a Southern switch. Southerners used to be Democrats for most of the 20th century. Southerners today are predominantly, not here in Memphis maybe, but predominantly Republican. This switch, by the way, again, is attributed to racism. But the truth of it is, as the South became less racist, it became more Republican. There's a documented, undisputed trend of a precipitous decline of racism, particularly in the second half of the 20th century. And as Southern racism declines dramatically, Southern Republicanism goes up. The real reason the South defected to the Republican Party has far more to do with the Reaganite platform of anti-communism, patriotism, free markets, anti-abortion or pro-life, Christianity, opposition to, if you will, the sexual revolution of the 1960s. This is what moved a morally conservative South into the Republican camp. And you might say, well, what about Nixon's Southern strategy? Nixon was told by his closest advisors, you are never going to win with the racist appeal to the Deep South. If you do that, you lose the whole rest of the country. Nixon wasn't an idiot. He was from California. He knew that. And so Nixon did not appeal to the Deep South, and he did not, in fact, win the Deep South. The Deep South was won by George Wallace. Nixon took the Upper South, or some states in the Upper South. And so he took the non-racist South by appealing to upward mobility. The South was changing, becoming less agrarian. There was actually much more commerce in the South. And so the upwardly mobile, pro-market, up by your bootstraps, capitalist South, this became ripe pickings for the Republican Party. And now I'll say a word, I want to say a word about fascism. Because we're hearing the word used a lot. Trump is a fascist. Why is Trump a fascist? Well, because he's a nationalist. He's an ultra-nationalist. Trump wants to make America great again. Didn't Hitler want to make Germany great again? Well, the fascists were in fact nationalists. But nationalism is not a defining feature of fascism. And we can see this very clearly by simply looking at the fact that nationalism is equally common on the left as it is on the right. Gandhi was a nationalist. Mandela was a nationalist. Che Guevara was a nationalist. You're having Che Guevara week next week. I guess a celebration of a murderous thug. Very interesting. He was a nationalist. Fidel Castro was a nationalist. Every anti-colonial leader was. Winston Churchill was a nationalist. So was Abraham Lincoln. So were the American founders, to a man. So obviously all these people aren't fascists. The equation of nationalism and fascism is, I call it fake fascism. It is a big lie invented by the left to make fascism seem something other than it is. So really, what is fascism? What is fascism? Normally, if you want to know what a philosophy is, you'd say, all right, if you want to know what fascism, let's go to the great philosopher of fascism. But such a man would seem nowhere to be found. Very odd. Every other philosophy has a thinker, whether it's good or bad. Who's the philosopher of Marxism? Marx. Who's the philosopher of capitalism? Adam Smith. Who's the philosopher of fascism? Nobody knows. We can't find a textbook that tells us. Very interesting. Well, it's very interesting because the big lie is in full operation here. And here's what I mean. The philosopher of fascism is a guy named Giovanni Gentile. And although you may not have heard of him, he was considered in the early 20th century to be one of the leading thinkers of the first half of the 20th century. A major philosopher, a Hegelian, also a Marxist, by the way. And Gentile, who became Mussolini's Minister of Education, remember, Mussolini is the first fascist. Mussolini created the first fascist regime in the world. His march on Rome in 1922, 11 years before Hitler. Hitler revered Mussolini. He called him the last of the Caesars. So Giovanni Gentile defines fascism in this way. He says, everything in the state and nothing outside the state. You can now see later why Hitler called himself a National Socialist. Hitler changed the name of the German Workers' Party to put National Socialist in there. And so today, amazingly, when we hear the word Nazi, we never hear about socialism, even though socialism was actually central to fascism and central to National Socialism. In discussing this topic, Goebbels says, between nationalism and socialism, we have to go with socialism. Nationalism is the adjective, national, and socialism is the noun. In other words, we are first socialists and secondarily nationalists. These are the actual Nazis. And Gentile, in describing Nazism, uses a very telling analogy. He says, the way that fascism sees it, the state is like an organism. It's like a living creature. And every individual is like a cell in the organism. So does the cell have any rights? No. Does the cell have any value? No. The cell is only valuable insofar as it serves the state. This is the core of fascism. And I ask you, does this sound like the platform of the Republican Party? Or does it sound a little bit more like the platform of the left wing of the Democratic Party? Everything in the state and nothing outside the state. Now, let's come right to the present today and ask ourselves, where is fascism in America now? Ordinarily, we'd say fascism in America can be found in Charlottesville. Look at those white supremacists. They're neo-Nazis. That's where we see fascism. But those ragtag white supremacists are actually some of the least dangerous people in America. Why? Because they have no cultural or political power. Yeah, they can drive a car into someone, but they don't have the ability to drive a speaker off campus the way that Antifa does. They can't blockade an entire town. They don't have the mayor of Berkeley, Jesse Aragon, on their side as a member of one of their Facebook groups. They don't have powerful allies among the deans in academia, in Hollywood, in the Democratic Party. So if racism is really going to be dangerous, it's not only going to be allied with power, it's going to be ensconced in power itself. Look at this recent controversy about Harvey Weinstein. Now, why didn't all those women speak up before? Why now? The answer is really simple. Hollywood is a little oligarchy. It's an incestuous small family. It's like the Corleone family. And it has the power to destroy people who step outside. And I don't just mean step outside as victims of sexual harassment. If you step outside ideologically, they cancel your show. You'll never work in this town again. All those women didn't speak up because they feared they would never work in that town again. So this is the fascism of the institutions. It's the Hollywood boss that can throw you out of Hollywood and make sure you can't work in that industry. It is the powerful deans who control billion-dollar endowments who can take a young academic and turn him into, or her into, a pariah. You'll never get tenure. Try to get a job in the history department in any school that anyone has ever heard of again. It's Google, which can take a guy who writes a memo contesting their diversity policy, put him on the street. We live in an America today. Now, the Nazis used a term called Gleichschaltung, which means coordination. But what the Nazis mean is we have to have the whole culture speak with one voice. No one can march out of lockstep. This was, by the way, the whole meaning. You wonder why, if you see Nazi films, everyone's doing this. Why do they do that? Why do they give Heil Hitler salutes? Why do they fly swastikas off of their balconies? The point of the Heil Hitler salute and the swastika is to signal that you are politically correct. You are in conformity with the ideology of Nazism. You're saying, I'm a good Nazi, check out my swastika. And we have that on campus today. We don't have Heil Hitler salutes, but we have the same demand that the whole culture march in lockstep. And if you're a true dissident, you're called a hater, a hater. Now, all of you here are in a position to decide for yourself, have I actually been advocating hate, or have I actually been identifying the true party of hate? I've actually been exposing hate at its core, and I've been exposing a big lie in which the party that actually perpetrated slavery, racism, and hate is now disguising itself. The very guys who poisoned the water are showing up as the water commissioner. It's kind of a scam. It's kind of a scam. And if the Democrats really cared about race today, because people will say, well, where's the racism in America now, Dinesh? Well, the racism now, I think, is sadly to be seen in what I will call our urban plantations. And by that I mean Detroit and inner city Baltimore and Oakland and all these places which, by the way, trillions of dollars have been spent. And yet many of these places are just as bad as they were in 1968. Now, do you see Jesse Jackson down there protesting? Do you see all these progressive left-wingers down there? Are they taking a knee against the school board that is running schools where no one learns anything? I was reading a book on the slave plantation, and it described the features of the slave plantation. This is Kenneth Stamp's book, the historian Kenneth Stamp, called The Peculiar Institution. And he says the slave plantation was characterized by dilapidated housing, just broken down slave quarters, by broken families, very few nuclear intact families, by a high degree of violence that was necessary to hold a place together. That's why slave plantations would have sometimes barbed wire fences. By the absence of opportunity, nobody could ever get ahead. Slavery is obviously for life. And finally, by a mood of nihilism and despair. And I ask you, are those 5 features of the slave plantation not now overwhelmingly present, tragically, not only in our inner cities, not only involving blacks, but also on Native American reservations, also in the barrios where Latinos are, and increasingly in white communities, which are economically devastated, where you have high degrees of opioid addiction. This is the America we live in now. And so my message is this. To me, the race card and the fascism card are frauds. They're being played not to have a debate, but to prevent a debate. They are efforts to try to find a group of people and say, you are the bad guys. We don't have to discuss health care or education reform or inner city tax incentives or anything with you because you're like Hitler in the 1930s. We've got to get rid of you by any means necessary. And so the charge that Trump is like Hitler is actually being used by the left as a pretext, as a cover for all kinds of inexcusable behavior, including violence, that would never otherwise be allowed or condoned. Can you imagine mainstream Democrats refusing to go to the inauguration? What if Republicans said, we're skipping Obama's inauguration? There'd be a media meltdown if that happened. So, unfortunately to me, the gentleman's politics of the 1980s is gone. We're living in a much rougher environment, and when I see these physical clashes between the Trumpsters and the left and Antifa, it almost throws my mind historically back to Mussolini's black shirts of the 20s or Hitler's brown shirts of the 30s. It's a worrisome moment of American politics. My message to you is be actually on the side of the good guys. And the way to do that, the first step, don't be suckers for the big lie. Don't march in lockstep. Don't participate in left-wing Gleichschaltung. Stand up for yourself, speak up for yourself, demand that your campus exhibit a wide variety of points of view so you can truly learn and think for yourself. If you doubt anything I've said today, I have not even made any statement that is controversial in the sense of doubtful whether this really happened. It's controversial in the sense that you haven't been taught it. It's controversial in the sense that it's news to you. But it's not controversial in the sense that it actually occurred. So I'm very pleased to be here. I want to thank you for inviting me, and I want to open the door to questions. Thank you very much.
All right, guys. Hey. At this time, we'll be taking you guys' questions. If you do have a question now, please line up on this pink line right where Jake is. But if a question pops up later, please remember to just walk in between the aisles and behind everyone so as not to disturb what's going on up here. But you guys can start lining up now. Please remember to keep your questions an actual question. Keep it short. And yeah, go for it.
First off, I love to say I'm a very big fan of yours, me and my grandmother both. Of all of you saying about the not being a puppet, what would be your advice to someone who is unfortunately has a sibling who is a puppet, so, quote unquote? And also, I'm trying to get my friends interested in politics, but I don't want to be just beating them down. What would be your advice to get them more politically active, and what would be your advice to give to someone whose sister is pretty much a puppet of the far left?
Yes. First of all, I think we should recognize that a lot of young people who are drawn to these ideas, the ideas of the left, are actually drawn to them out of idealism. So their motives are not bad. They actually have a passion for justice. And sometimes I think that older people misrepresent conservatism when they say to young people things like, okay, you're a left-winger right now because you're an idealist. Wait till you're 50 years old and jaded like me and have to pay taxes and you're going to become a conservative. So we don't want that. The idealism of young people is really good, and it's very healthy. To my mind, it is being cynically manipulated by some very powerful people, and by powerful people here I mean academics, I mean powerful people in media. Here's the problem: the left dominates academia, the media, and Hollywood, all three. And so it's very easy to get out big lies, because the big lies reverberate from one to the other. Even if this guy in the fourth row knew it's a lie, he wouldn't be able to contest it because he doesn't have a big enough megaphone. So my advice to you is to not use the hard line approach, but to use sort of Socratic questioning to raise questions. Because the beauty of truth is that, particularly in an atmosphere of political correctness, the truth kind of breaks through, kind of like the sun coming through the clouds. So you just drop a single fact or a single proposition on the table, and someone who's been fed the left-wing diatribe goes, whoa, that's not true. And the party switch sides. And you're like, hey, you know, I'm on Google right now. Let's look at all the Dixiecrats. Here they are. It's a long, long list. Guess how many of these guys switch sides? So you kind of tease someone into learning about the truth. And then you say, here's the book for you to read. Hey, Dinesh has a movie in the theater. I'll buy you a ticket if you'll agree to go. It's missionary work, and it's a little strange that you sometimes have to conduct it within the family, but my best wishes to you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, I'm a really big fan of yours. And I kind of had read about like a lot of leftism in academia, but I didn't really believe it until I kind of started paying more attention. And I was wondering, why do you think there are so many leftists like in academia?
Oh, good question. How did the inmates take over the asylum? How did the infestation get so bad? Well, I think it's two things. First of all, I do think that there is a temperamental difference between conservatives and progressives, which inclines the progressive more to academia. Here's what I mean. By and large, conservatives respect the world of business. And so they see success as going into the business world and having a professional career or starting your own business. They would admire an entrepreneur who creates a new company far more than, say, a professor of Romance languages at Bowdoin College. Right? But the progressives are different. They actually care less. They're a little bit allergic to to capitalism. They are a little anti-business by temperament, and so they think that they'd rather go into journalism or they'd rather go into academia. If that was the only problem, though, it would create lopsidedness, but it wouldn't create monopoly. The monopoly has to be enforced. So what happens is once the left has a majority in a department, they freeze everybody else out. This doesn't happen everywhere, but it happens in a lot of places. So then even if you have a young conservative, I mean, when I was 19 years old or 22 years old, I would have loved to be an academic. But I saw, wait a minute, if I try to become, let's say, a professor at Tulane or Princeton or Dartmouth, where I went to college, I go, I can work for years on my PhD, I can publish important books, and will most likely be vetoed on ideological grounds alone. Now, my proof of this is that if you look at some of the leading African American scholars in the country, my colleague at the Hoover Institution, Thomas Sowell, who's recognized even by progressives as a renowned academic, he taught at the University of Chicago, and I asked him, have you been courted by the Ivy League? And he goes, I have never had a single approach, let alone a job offer. So what this shows you is that the left is not interested in having real debate. The kind of debate that they like is a debate between 7 species of Marxists. All of them fighting over fine points of doctrine. Was Trotsky right? Was Bukharin right? This kind of thing. And that's not wrong. It's not wrong to have that debate, but it's a very narrow debate, and it misses the bigger debates in the country. Okay, next question.
Do you have an opinion about revisiting the whole question of Confederate statues? It's kind of a sticky, a messy issue. It's not one that makes me very comfortable, but there are some Confederate statues and some things in the Confederate legacy that probably should be removed or redressed, or at least in my opinion. I'm curious what you think about this.
Well, I shouldn't say I don't have a hard line, but it's not that I have the view that every statue that was put up for whatever reason must remain up, and to take a statue down is to, quote, get rid of history. That's not my view. My view is that statues are put up to reflect, they're monuments to things we cherish. They're different in that sense than a book in a library. If somebody said, I want to take out all the books by Jefferson Davis from the University of Memphis library, that is a very serious problem, and that would be a threat to openness of ideas that should be stopped immediately. It's a little different than saying, I want to have a statue in the town square that says this or says that. Now, that being said, I think that my objection to the pulling down of the statues isn't that I side with the Confederacy. I think the Confederacy was wrong. I think the Confederacy was wrong because I agree with Lincoln. And what Lincoln basically said was this. Lincoln said, it's actually unbelievably relevant to our situation now. Lincoln basically said, we've had a free election. Who won? I did. And not only did I win for myself, I won representing a group of ideas and a mandate of what I stood for, and I'm not at liberty to give that up. So I can't trade away the mandate of my election. It's not mine. I don't own it. It was given to me by the American people through the process of the electoral majority. The reason I think this is interesting is that now, today, it seems to me, not since 1860 has a major party, happens to be the same party, proved itself utterly unwilling to accept the result of a lawful election. And part of what's going on, undoubtedly, and this Confederate statue thing is just a pawn in that battle, is the effort to get Trump out of there on the grounds that he is somehow de facto illegitimate. The media is basically saying when you have an election in America, we have veto power over the result. If we think that the guy is out of bounds, we get to run him out of town. And if we can't do it legally, we have to think of some scheme to pull it off, a kind of a quasi-legal coup to get rid of him. So, you know, obstruction of justice. Now, normally obstruction of justice requires an underlying crime. In Watergate, there was obstruction of justice, but there was an underlying crime, the Watergate burglary. Imagine obstruction of justice with no underlying crime. Trump didn't collude with Russia. He said to Comey, hey, Comey, there's nothing there. There's no collusion. Shut down your silly investigation. Is that obstruction of justice? There's no injustice that's been perpetrated in the first place. But the left doesn't really care right now. They are on the warpath against Trump, and the weird thing is they have colluding with them some Republicans we could name. One or two from this state, I might note. So it's a funny business that's going on here. And so that's my view of the whole matter. I wouldn't leave every statue that's standing. I just want to see a more open debate about the role of people like Buchanan, Stephen Douglas. I don't want the South to take an unfair burden in the Civil War. Even Abraham Lincoln said, if I was a Southerner, I would have the Southern position. In other words, his point was that slavery was profitable in the South and generated a culture that is not the fault of the Southern people. Now, that being said, he said that the American founders recognized that slavery was a wrong. Here's how Lincoln put it beautifully. He's describing the difference between the two parties. We believe slavery is wrong and should be restricted. You believe it is right and should be extended. And that was that was the basic issue in the campaign of 1860, and that was really what the Civil War ultimately ended up being about. Okay, let's go on. Next question.
Oh, you're going to hold them? Okay. Hi, my name is Sydney Kessler. I'm with the Progressive Student Alliance, and I also want to point out that we are in another room because we were not allowed in here, and that we have plenty of questions because you said that progressives or leftists do not want to ask questions, but we are not allowed in this space but one person. So I would encourage you to invite them in here to ask those questions so that I'm not the only person asking my question. So, again, my name is Sydney Kessler, and I'm with
Well, may I pause for a second? Let me ask you something.
Yeah.
Are you not in here because someone said you can't come or because you showed up late?
Well, we were late, right? But we were also told that...
Okay, just saying.
No. But we were also told that it started at 7:30. So that's also a little... we were told it starts at 7:30.
Well,
could you please ask your question?
All right.
But I do have my question, and I'm not here to debate the room. So my question was, you said that the liberals run the state. You said that the liberals run the media, the school. I can't remember the other one, but you didn't say the state.
Well, I said Hollywood, academia, and media.
And media, but you didn't say the state. But you also mentioned earlier that in order to have balance, you should have different ideas. So if they don't run the state, how do we have power to leverage our ideas?
Well, I'm not saying, when you say run the state, you mean the state of Tennessee?
Well, you said the state, period. You said that the state, that Marxists or communists believe that the state should all have control, right?
Right.
And so if you are saying that, right, and then so to combat that argument means that both parties need to exist, right, and in the state realm to have control. So if we are not in the state and we are only in academia, we're only in school, media, Hollywood, then how do we have power or leverage other than those things?
Oh, I see. Gotcha. Well,
how is that then not, right, the same state of fascism that you say exists if you admittedly say that the Republican or the whatever wing holds the majority of the state, or holds the state, period, right, or holds that realm of control? Yes.
So the question is basically this, and that is that am I arguing that progressives should be, who are dominant in academia and media, should somehow be excluded from the state? In other words, from governmental...
No, that wasn't my question. You said they were. Because you said that they dominate these spaces, which means they do not dominate the state space, right? And so if they do not dominate the state space, how is that then not fascist if you said fascism is to dominate the state space?
Right. So fascism is not one party controlling, in any democratic system, one party is going to win elections, correct? And if you look at American history, generally one party has dominated American politics, not only in a particular election, but typically for 30 or 40 years at a time. From the 1820s to 1860, the Democrats were the dominant party. By this I mean they didn't control everything, but they generally had one, if not both, houses of Congress and the presidency. From 1865 to 1932, the Republicans were the dominant party. From 1932 to 1980, the Democrats were the dominant party. Now, interestingly, from 1980 to 2016, American politics has been a draw. You've generally had divided government. Reagan was the president for 8 years in the 80s, Democratic Congress. Clinton was the president for 8 years in the 90s, Republican majorities in the House and the Senate. Obama is the president. He loses in the midterm election. A Republican takes both houses of Congress. This is why the 2016 election was so incendiary, because the left realized that not only was it about the presidency, but if Trump won, the Republicans would get both houses of Congress, and they might even get the court. Now, this is not fascism. This is called democracy, right? Because you're running for free elections.
Your argument, I'm sorry, your argument then is that the United States goes from being fascist to being unfascist and back and forth from one fascist of Democratic to Republican. That's your argument then, because that means to hold the state position. That's what you said. So I'm quoting what you said.
Right.
And then literally asking the question. So.
Okay. So. Listen to what I'm saying now, because I'm actually about to say what fascism is, and fascism is not winning an election.
You've already defined it.
Right, but I wanted to define it more clearly because you didn't get it, right? Because.
I disagree with it. I'm using your definition to.
No.
Say that's incorrect.
Everything.
So then you get to expound on what you've already defined.
Right, because everything in the state and nothing outside the state. This is what it means. It means that the government.
Are you counteracting what you said at first? Let us say so.
I'm not denying what I said. It clearly needs a little more elaboration. That's all I'm doing, okay? So if you look at actual fascist regimes like Mussolini's Italy or Nazi Germany, the government controlled the private sector. You had a private sector, but the government told it what to do. Now notice we have that in America today. Obamacare is like that. In Obamacare, we don't have true socialism because the government hasn't nationalized the healthcare industry. We have private hospitals, we have private hospices, we have private health insurance. But notice, the government tells them what to do. The government sets the prices. The government decides who's eligible. That is actually a fascist policy. Okay, now, fascism though meant government control of all private industry, and it also meant government control of your life. So fascist governments want to regulate the lives of their citizens. America is based on the opposite, i.e. anti-fascist principle, limited government. Limited government means that whoever wins the election doesn't matter because there's certain things the government can't do. The government can't tell you what to say. The government can't tell you what religion to practice. In fact, the government can't take your money. The United States is a society where, imagine if 99% of us decided that Steve Jobs and his family are too rich. They've got $10 billion. What do they need $10 billion for? So we are going to take a vote to go and confiscate $9 billion of their 10 and spend it on things we think are important. We can't do that. Why? Because he earned that money. He didn't steal it. He made iPhones. You don't have to buy them. You went to the store and stood in line at Apple. You skipped class to go get the Apple iPhone 8 or whatever. So there's no theft, there's no injustice, and so the state does not have the power to take that guy's stuff. That's fascism is the argument that the state does. And I'm simply saying that the progressive left favors increased centralized power in this country over the economy, if not over citizens' lives, and that has a fascist streak to it. Okay?
First, I'd like to say thank you for coming out, and I just appreciate this is a free event that I actually had the ability to come here. I wouldn't call myself a Republican. I'm a constitutionalist. That's what I describe myself as, and the Second Amendment particularly is probably the most important to me because it gives us the ability to defend all other amendments. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of the free state, the right of the people to bear arms shall not be infringed. Why do you think that certain areas, not necessarily of just government, just why do you think people in general who most of the time have zero to little knowledge at all of firearms seem to be the ones so heavily and vehemently against them as a whole, not just, 30-round magazines or all these other things, just the whole entire ideology of a firearm? Why do you feel as if it is so combated?
Well, first of all, I want to affirm a point you said a moment ago, which is that the Second Amendment does not exist for hunting. It's not ultimately about the fact that some people like to go shoot deer and they need sports weapons to do that. The real purpose of the First Amendment is to protect the citizens from their own government, from the risk of government tyranny. Okay? That's why it's there. That's why it's there. Now, the progressives want to dominate the state, and they want to have increasing state control over the lives of citizens. Having an armed citizenry is a major check on that. And I believe that ultimately that's what drives gun control. Because think about it. What gun control policy could have prevented Las Vegas? Even Dianne Feinstein said, I can't even think of any. Number two, what purpose is served by taking guns away from law-abiding citizens if your point is actually to prevent non-law-abiding citizens from killing them? So I think that the gun debate has sort of lost its moorings and rationality. I mean, I don't own a gun. In fact, I'm a felon. I can't own a gun. So I'm gun-free. Progressives will be very happy to learn. I think my wife is trying to speak up in the back row there. She actually has her CHL in Texas. Many people don't realize, but she's my security. Bottom line of it is I'd like to see a rational gun debate. And the reason that the gun issue, the left relies on, remember Rahm Emanuel's never let a good crisis go to waste. So whenever there's some panic, they actually hope to ride the panic to pass a law that may even seem senseless 3 weeks later, but you did it in a panic. And so the use of crisis is, by the way, the fascists were like experts at this. They used the Reichstag fire, was what Hitler used to get the Enabling Act passed, which gave him essentially supreme power over Nazi Germany. He didn't have it before that. The parliament gave it to him. And he used some say a manufactured crisis, that's debated by scholars, but nevertheless a crisis in order to claim that power. Okay, next question.
Okay, so as a 20-something millennial, I know a lot of people who are very leftist, and I consider myself more open-minded and a little bit more like socially conservative. That doesn't matter. But anyway, so sometimes it scares me talking to people because they seem so manipulated and so like almost brainwashed into the whole leftist movement that they don't really seem open to any sort of form of discussion. And I know you touched on like how young people are idealists, but I was wondering how you see the future of this movement going in what direction and like what it's going to turn into.
There is a left tradition of intellect and scholarship and activism, and I don't think that by itself that's unhealthy in a democracy. In my democracy, there would be a left, and it would actually be agitating for things. And it's true that the left has actually fought for some good causes over the 20th century, workers' rights and so on. So I'm not disputing leftism per se. What I'm actually disputing is a certain, let's call it zombie leftism, that is a phenomenon of our time. It's actually very scary. When I was at Politicon a year and a half ago, I was debating this guy from the Young Turks named Cenk Uygur. And Cenk himself is a little bit of a loathsome character, but nevertheless, he essentially, what he does is he batters you with invective and accusations. And as you try to explain, he interrupts and throws new accusations. But actually, Cenk didn't scare me. I mean, he's a certain kind of type that was recognizable to me from India. But what scared me was, in the audience, Cenk had about 30 Cenk robots. And these literally were programmed where anytime Cenk said something, however stupid, they would all stand up and cheer wildly, right? And it was almost like Cenk was actually hitting a button. And these guys were all jumping up. And yet, if you talk to them individually, they were intelligent people. They went to good schools and so on. But the problem was that they were in a robotic frame of mind. Now, part of what creates this robotic frame of mind is a mob mentality. Notice that when you have a crowd, it acts by a certain group logic of its own that is not the logic of its individual members. Right? The crowd all moves in one direction. Hang that guy, get rid of him, kill him, hang him, fry him. This is a mob mentality. And mob mentalities are extremely dangerous because they spread like fire. So the antidote to mob mentality is, first of all, to avoid that intellectual homogeneity that allows it to set fire in the first place. So the mob mentality is fed by open-minded people like you, keeping silent, because the mob relies on your silent acquiescence. And if you say no, suddenly the mob has got to deal with you as an individual, and suddenly the mob is somewhat disrupted. So my advice to you is to be courageous, and not courageous on behalf of conservatism, courageous on behalf of independent thought. Resist the mob. Don't go along. Ultimately, the Nazis had it so well done that they could go into Jewish neighborhoods and round people up and put them into buses, and other people who would not have approved of this would see this going on, but they didn't want to ask any questions. They knew something bad was happening. Now, the Nazis did not say, we're killing these people. In fact, all the death camps were outside of they were outside of Germany. They were in Nazi-occupied Poland. All the 6 death camps were there. There were concentration camps in Germany, but those were labor camps. So, bottom line, don't fall for the robot sensibility. Be an individual. Okay? I think we have one more question, and then I'd like to
This will be our last question.
Wrap up. Go ahead.
So you mentioned historically we've got slavery, then second wave slavery and segregation. What do you think about the idea of third wave slavery in prison and possibly the school to prison pipeline?
I think you're, am I right that you're referring to this mass incarceration, drug arrests, large numbers of people being sent to prison?
And disproportionate amounts of blacks in prison compared to whites.
Yeah. So, you know, this is a very interesting topic that 5 years ago, if you had asked me about it, I would have a different view than I do today. And I have to admit that the different view was produced by my own adventures in the judicial system. Had you told me 5 years ago, 95% of defendants who stepped forth in the federal judicial system are found guilty, I would say, well, that's probably because 95% of them did it. That's why they're found guilty. Why else would they be found guilty? They are having a free trial and so on. Having gone through the system, I now realize that this was in fact a very naive view. It was a case in which I actually was a sucker, you may say, for the idealistic civics book America and not the real America. The civics book America is better that 9 guilty men go free than 1 innocent man be hanged. That is not the America we live in now. Many innocent people are prosecuted. Many innocent people are sitting in prison. The reason for this, it might have been well-meaning at the beginning, but prosecutors have so much power. Let's say, for example, there's a group of prosecutors and there's a doctor in Memphis and they would like, let's just say an ambitious prosecutor wants to run for office for the DA's job or for Senate and decides, I want a big case. This is the most famous doctor in Memphis. I want to get that guy locked up. It's very easy to do. First, you go through the accordion-like book of federal statutes, and you find a crime. And the crime is often something vague, making a false statement to a public officer, or administering illegal pain pills. Now, all doctors administer pain pills, but all you have to do is file a charge. The moment you file a charge, the doctor's reputation has been destroyed because he's now under arraignment, he's under indictment. And this is when the fun begins. You step in to see him and you say, listen, not only am I accusing you of illegally administering pain pills, I'm accusing you of concealing that fact, making false statements to your patients, filing false federal reports about what you do. When we add up all these offenses, you're looking at 50 years in prison. But here's the good news. If you don't contest the charge, you plead guilty, we will agree to give you 6 months in prison and you can never practice medicine again. Now, I would submit that it doesn't matter whether you're guilty or not guilty. In fact, if you're not guilty, it makes no difference whatsoever. You're going to take that deal. Why? You can't risk destroying your whole life, 50 years in prison. And remember that it doesn't. You can say, well, we have a justice system, we have a jury. They're going to bring you into prison in handcuffs and leg irons. You're going to be wearing prison uniform. The jury is going to think, oh my God, there's a criminal. Why would the government be charging this guy if he didn't prescribe illegal pain pills? This is actually the frightening reality of our judicial system. In my case involving $20,000 given to a college friend of mine running for office, I had FBI agents reading my books, going through my tax returns, having access to all my bank records going way back. This is the actual power of the federal government against us. So to me, yes, this is a real issue. And I don't have the trust in the system. Not that I don't have trust in cops. I like cops. But the system has built into it some very serious problems that need to be looked at, of which the issue of drug offenses and proportionality, because proportionality is the essence of justice, right? I mean, in my case, for example, people say, well, Dinesh, you're a felon. In fact, this is the favorite social media chant of the left. Dinesh is a felon. Okay, but it also, did I break the law? I did. I actually exceeded the campaign finance law. But no American has been prosecuted, let alone locked up for doing what I did. And so if justice is a matter not just of did you break the law, but was the penalty proportional to the crime? Did other guys who did the same thing get the same penalty? Then you'd have to say that my case is a travesty. So the fact that my case is a travesty makes me much more disposed to believe there's a heck of a lot of travesties going on, and I would like to see Trump open up, and this would be very good for a Republican to do, a real investigation into our own justice system, the way it is actually prosecuted. I mean, look at the way we find out how our government uses the FBI, the IRS, the Justice Department. They send SWAT teams against people that they don't like. Political dissidents, which is basically what the fascists did, but also other people who are threats in one way or the other. And this is a very bad thing. So, to sum up, my defense of America is not America, America, rah, rah, rah. No. No. We have to defend not just the ideal America of the founding, but the real America that we live in now. And so I think that liberal, conservative, left or right, this is our mission, to figure out a way to fix America as she is so it can live up to the promise and the ideals of the American founding. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.